This week in our I'm Good, Not Really series, we have talked about anxiety. And I am grateful to have Melissa King here with us today, and she is a counselor with Tapestry Psychological Associates. And we're grateful to have you talk to us about a really, really important subject that carries a stigma with it, and a lot of people struggle with it. And you work with adults and kids and everybody in between. So as a counselor, how do you see anxiety making an impact in this community?
Yeah, I see a lot of health anxiety now, and I would say I saw a real uptick in that after COVID, and just a lot from young kids, even all the way to adults, being very anxious about their own health and some maybe feelings that they were having symptoms and then overthinking it. I had seen that prior, but I would say there's definitely been an uptick in that. I see perfectionism and a fear of failure, kind of a fear of letting things, letting a plate drop, so to speak, feeling like they have to carry, in young kids even, putting pressure on themselves to perform and to please. I do see relational conflicts as well. Little girls coming in that are having friend trouble. Middle school is a big age gap where kids start having a lot of relational issues or bullying and things like that. So, and all of those lead to anxiety for certain people.
Is there a way to define anxiety? Meaning, what is there a clinical definition of anxiety or some practical definition you use? What is the difference between general worry and being technically anxious about something? How do you help discern that in people's lives?
Yeah. Well, there is a diagnostic manual in the mental health world called the DSM-5, and that's at the 5th edition, so they kind of keep updating it every few years. And so I actually looked it up because I do have to refer to that, but I had looked up just to kind of refresh and remember because they do change things here and there. But it typically centers around, they say, excessive worry and inability to control worry. So here's what I would say the difference practically that I will see in my office is all of us can have worries or just thoughts that pop in our head, or maybe gravitate sometimes towards negative thinking patterns. Different people that struggle with worry, will you hear something, maybe a kid hears something even on the news, every other kid maybe who doesn't struggle with worry hears that and thinks, oh, well, that's scary, or I don't like that, and they can move right on. A kid or an adult even who excessively worries and has an inability to cope, that just gets stuck for them, and they are stuck on that thought or that scary image or, just something really fearful, and they just can't move past it. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so, and some of the other things they say is sleeplessness, sleep disturbances, irritability, a lot of emotional outbursts, which could be crying, but could be anger, could be all different kinds of things, because if you're constantly living in that state of not being able to work through your negative thoughts or not being able to work through worry, it puts you at a state of high agitation. Does that make sense?
Do you think anxiety has increased, or is it just we are more willing to talk about it right now? What's your opinion on that?
I know that's it. We will even discuss that at our office. We'll kind of discuss, because I will say, when I started out in the profession, I guess it was 13 years ago. We did have a clientele. There were people, but it took me a little while as a new professional to build my practice and to get it. And then we have people that have started within the last 2 years, and they will be full within a year.
Wow.
So there's a huge difference in just the need and the people reaching out. And I will say, I don't think worry obviously is a new thing. It's in Scripture. They tell us in Scripture not to worry, and it's addressed about trusting and all those kinds of things. So that's an age-old, thing. But I do think that is where maybe, I don't know if it's a positive, I guess, of social media and just the media that we see. Like you see on television shows, people going to their therapist. It's like a common day thing. There's whole shows created around therapy practices, and NBA stars saying on TV that they have a therapist, so there's much more exposure and normalization of it. So I would say that's a good thing, I guess, in a way, because it kind of created an avenue for people to feel like they could ask for help and reduce the stigma of it.
Yeah. Well, so you have talked before in previous conversation we had about anxiety, and generally speaking, there are two ways to handle or to address anxiety, both of which are probably not great.
Yeah.
So what are the two typical ways that people handle those situations in life that make them anxious? And talk us through that and maybe a better approach than those two things.
Yeah. So typically it's human nature that if you are anxious about it, you would either can try to control it in some way. And I will say you kind of see this sometimes. You'll see this in a marital dynamic, or even where you have one person who maybe is the over responder and the over fixer. Okay, there's a problem, I'm gonna step in, let's try to fix this, let's try to control it. And then you may have the one who kind of shuts down and withdraws. And typically they are more of an avoider. So there's like the avoidance piece and then the control piece. And I mean, we can oscillate, everybody, each person can kind of oscillate between those two roles depending on what it is. But I see that a lot in my office. You know, practically speaking, I can think of even adults that I work with who, let's say, they are very anxious about driving on the interstate. Then they maybe even some of them had a negative experience, maybe some of them didn't even, but just for whatever reason, they've gotten very anxious about driving on the interstate. And then it's like, well, I'm just gonna avoid that and I'm only gonna take back roads. And this is a real story of somebody I know that 12 years later has still not driven on the interstate.
Really?
Because of it being such an anxiety for them. Every time they would try, they would have a panic attack. So then it was like, I'm just not gonna do that. And then it creates this dynamic of now that you've avoided this thing for so long, so now it's just this Goliath in your head. It's this monster of, I can never do that, so I always have to avoid that. I mean, that's an extreme,
sure.
You know.
But Atlanta, the highway's it's a dangerous place.
Yes. Yeah. And so there's that kind of avoidance piece. Or kids, let's say I've seen this with middle school students where they have a negative experience at school. They get made fun of or they get called out in a class or whatever it is. And then it gets to the level where they're like, I'm not going back. I am never going to that school again. And then they start to struggle with school refusal. You know, so that's an example of avoidance of I've had this experience, now I'm making this rule that I'll never do that again.
Okay, so control on one side, that's the more perfectionistic, and then avoidance. So what is the better way to address anxiety in your life?
Well, I would say step one would be all of us have tendencies, I would say, towards one or the other in a way. And like I said, you can oscillate between both, but I think self-awareness and self-reflection of being able to step back and say, okay, what is my temperament? And I am not a avoider, I'm a controller. I know that about myself. Yeah. So I just have to be aware of that. So if something anxious happens or there's a big change in my family, for example, I'm aware of that enough now, but there were probably times when I was not early on where I would get into like, okay, hyper fix-it mode. What do we need to change? What do we need to do? What does she need to do? You know? And you can just get into that where it puts you in an anxious state because you're so trying to fix and control everything. So I would say the antidote to that for a person who's doing that is just surrender and trust in a way of, and I know that sounds really cliche, but more practically speaking, it's like you have to know what tendency you have, and you kind of have to lean into that, the opposite, in a way of, okay, the self-awareness of I'm doing this again, or this is what I do, so I need to kind of really evaluate what is within my control and what's not in my control, and really surrender those things that are outside of my control. And then I would say for the avoider, you kind of have to do the opposite of leaning into the uncomfortable, hard thing that you don't want to do. And so practically speaking, what I tell clients is just start every day doing something little, something small that you typically would avoid, you know, because it's uncomfortable or it's distressing. You know, lean into, if you have social anxiety, really lean into that and put yourself in a situation where you have to socialize and be uncomfortable with that. And then it's like the more you kind of practice with the small things, then hopefully when the big things come, you can kind of lean into the distress of that. Does that make sense?
In another setting in which you were talking to our team about some of these issues, you talked about we want to get to the point where we can enjoy doing hard things. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a wonderful piece of advice for someone who might avoid hard things. Mm-hmm. We can get to the point where we actually enjoy doing hard things.
Yeah.
So maybe a few questions that people might have. You are not just a counselor, you're a mom, so you have kids. So you come at this not just as a professional, but also this is your daily life, you know, with kids. If my child is dealing with some symptoms of anxiety, what kinds of things do I want to look out for as a parent? And at what point might I really want to think about helping them get some outside help like you or somebody else?
Yeah. What I say is you never want, and it could be multiple kids, but even if it's the adult, like even if it's one of the parents, because what happens with anxiety, because it is so rooted in control, and also for somebody who's really suffering with anxiety, their whole worldview often comes to a place of trying to, avoid distress, feel comfortable, and by whatever means that is, And so I tell this to my own kids, so it'll look very selfish. So when you have somebody who's really, really struggling with anxiety, whether it's a child or an adult, odds are they will start to monopolize the whole family. Like their needs, their demands of, no, I'm not eating there. That's an anxiety avoidance sometimes. I'm not doing that. I'm not going here because I'm scared, and it's like you want to validate, because it's a lot of times they're not lying. They really are scared. Yeah. But I would say when it's getting to a point of, and that's the families that will often come to my office where their whole family is being overrun by maybe one child or a parent or somebody whose anxiety is super high. And that's usually what leads them there. And that's when I do say, like, that's to a point of where it's too far. And you need to reach out for help in that situation.
Yeah, because even kids at a little age are struggling with some of these.
Mm-hmm.
My wife is a pediatric nurse, and she would talk about very young patients who were pulling out all their eyelashes and bedwetting and other things out of nowhere, which is all a manifestation of anxiety.
Yeah.
Another issue that maybe some Christian parents in particular might have questions about is the use of medications for anxiety. Sometimes people feel like that's not a good thing, or that's not trusting the Lord or something. How might we think about medication, and do you have any opinions as to how to make those kind of decisions as a parent?
Yeah, and those are difficult decisions, especially I think when you're a parent trying to make that for a child. It's like if an adult is making that decision to get on medication, sometimes that's an easier choice. Not always, but sometimes it's a little bit easier. But I understand just the impact. People have concerns about their child's brains aren't fully formed yet, and they're still growing and developing. And so there's concerns about that. But what I say is kind of in that same vein is the way I approach it with parents all the time is like, let's do everything we can first, without trying medication. But then if it gets to the point where it is just controlling everybody's lives and nobody can function, that might be a consideration. And how, just to kind of address the shame and the stigma is, the brain's an organ. And so is your kidneys. And so, your liver, and we wouldn't tell a kid that was diabetic that we're not going to give them medication if they're really not functioning and we've exhausted all, most people wouldn't, I guess. Maybe there might be some. But I would say just kind of looking at it like that as well. It's a hard decision to make, but we are born with we're in the fall, and we're born with genetic predispositions towards certain conditions, and anxiety is one of them, depression is one of them,
I love this line. I don't know if you said it, but I'll give you credit. So talking about medicine, I love this quote. Medicine can help you stop drowning, but you still have to learn to swim to the shore.
Yes.
And so while medicine can help, there are certainly a multiple variety of ways that we need to address anxiety in a way that pleases the Lord. Last question. My message on anxiety was entitled The Anxiety Opportunity. In what ways do you see anxiety as an opportunity for someone to trust in the Lord and for it to actually draw them closer to Him?
Yeah. I always try to tell my clients that anxiety is awful. And it's really, especially people who struggle at very intense levels, it can just be such a horrible place to be. And I will say this to them sometimes. I'll say, listen, I know you want to punch me in the face when I tell you this, but it really, just like anything else in our life, it is an opportunity to lean into our weakness and our area of struggle and to our dependence. And sometimes what I tell clients is, God never meant us to be perfect or to have it all together. And I think it's a lot of those mindsets that lead to more anxiety. Yeah. So when we can fully embrace our limitations and be aware of that and not deny that, push it out, repress it, and just really come to a place of acceptance of that, we often recover and kind of work through that anxiety, you know, I want to say quicker, because everybody's journey is different on how long, you know, that kind of takes. But I do think and I would say my own personal anxiety has pushed me to just recognize my own limitations and my need for a savior.
That's a good word. Well, Melissa, thanks so much for investing in those who are seeking to just address this issue of anxiety in their life. And we'll have information for ways they can connect with you in the notes here. But thank you for being here today to talk about this. And we're so grateful for you and so many in your field that are helping believers and non-believers figure out how to process all this and ultimately see it as a way to connect to the Lord. So thank you so much.